Welcome to the overview of Chapter 8, Chapter 9 in the book as we take a look at campaigns and elections. This is in the unit, our last unit on political participation, and this unit is all about linkage institutions, looking at political parties as we first did, now looking at campaigns and elections. Next, we'll look at the interest groups and the impact that they have in connecting people to their government, as well as the role of the media and the role that the media plays as a linkage institution. But in this chapter, we're looking at campaigns and elections. How do campaigns serve as linkage institutions? How do elections serve as linkage institutions, connecting people to their government, to the policies that as part of the consent of the governed, that they are electing leaders over, that pass laws over them that they will then have to follow. So some key terms to take a look at. If you don't know the answers to these, definitely look them up. Check your concept cards, check your vocabulary and your reading guides. You will definitely want to know these in order to have a better conversation around these particular terms. Notice the focus on campaigns here, front-loading, the idea of moving primaries up in particular states in order to get more attention. We'll talk a lot about the FEC, looking at the Federal Election Commission, and the role that they play in campaigns and elections, really regulating good behavior, and to encourage good behavior, regulating bad behavior as well, but really changing the game in that regard. And then one I get a lot, the grassroots campaigns, kind of starting from the ground up. Hey, can you give $3? Can you give $5? And really kind of starting from there. Bernie Sanders did that in trying to create a grassroots campaign, giving $3 or $5 or whatever they can give. And then gerrymandering. We're going to see coming out this week the latest numbers from the census for 2020. Going to see how that impacts states in terms of reapportionment, the idea of how many districts they will have in each state, and then they will begin to redistrict their state, and many of them using gerrymandering to do it, helping to favor a particular political party in one way or another. We saw in Maryland that was to favor Democrats. We saw in Wisconsin that was to favor Republicans. And we have seen that time and again being used. The Supreme Court said it is constitutional. It is legal for them to do that. It is a political question, not a constitutional question, and therefore allowed for them to take on. All right, so let's look at the rules of the game. The idea here of elections. We have regular elections every 2 years. Every 2 years. We have elections here in the state of Maryland. And the idea is every even year, we have an election. We have a primary in the spring. We have a general election in the fall. That's on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. These are fixed elections and fixed terms for offices that we have. In the House of Representatives, it is a 2-year term. The president serves a 4-year term, and then the Senate serves 6-year terms. So every 4 years, we have a president that is up for re-election or election. We have House members, all 435 of them, that are up every 2 years. And then the Senate is staggered. The Senate has 33 or 34 people up every 2 years, such that the entire Senate then has seen election or re-election within a 6-year period. So if you were up in 2020, you aren't up again until 2026. And if you weren't up in 2020, maybe you're up in 2022 or 2024. But the idea is they're staggered so that within that 6-year cycle, all 100 seats in the Senate will be up for election. Term limits. The only term limit we have per the 22nd Amendment is on the presidency, is on the President of the United States, and that is 2 full 4-year terms or 10 years per the 22nd Amendment. This creates a lame duck status. Lame duck is anybody who is serving in an office to which they either are no longer running or no longer going to be in that office after the new term. Maybe they lost re-election, or they decided after this term they're not going to run again. They would be serving as a lame duck. They're no longer going to be in office, but they're still serving in that role until their term is up. That's a lame duck. Okay, and there were some states that tried to pass term limits on House and Senate members. The Supreme Court ruled that to be unconstitutional back in the 1990s and said that is a violation of Article 1 of the Constitution. It is unconstitutional. And then the last piece is winner take all. The idea that whoever wins the most votes for that district or for that state in a winner take all for the Electoral College, for instance, they win the votes for that state. So the winner takes it all. The second place person gets nothing. So if you are the first person to win the most votes, essentially first past the post, the person to win the most votes essentially wins the seat, and everyone else gets nothing. They get nothing as a result. It is not proportional representation. Proportional representation would be the idea that if you win 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. We don't have that. We have single-member districts in which if you win the most votes of the people running in that district, you win the seat for that district. That is winner take all. The same is true for the Electoral College, by the way. If you win the most votes of a state, you win all of the electoral votes for that state, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine. They're the only ones that award their electoral votes proportionally. If you win that particular district, you win the electoral vote for that district. And then statewide would be for the 2 electoral votes for the overall Senate. So that's what we see there in terms of the overall elections and kind of the rules of the game. We're going to look at campaign finance first, then we'll come back looking at presidential elections and then congressional elections. So it's important to think about power. The idea of power and political power in particular. Is it okay? Some people have more than others. Is it okay if someone has more money and is able to use that to exert their political power, even if others can't afford to do so? And I want you to think about those questions as we go through this chapter. Now, it's important to note the history of campaign finance. The idea here that we have not always been we've not always had campaign finance with us. It was after Watergate and the election of 1972 that we saw hundreds of millions of dollars poured into campaigns, and done so in a way that really raised eyebrows and raised red flags for Congress, such that they appointed a commission, the Federal Election Commission, to study this and come out with a report, which ultimately became the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Act, trying to address how do we keep money out of politics so that we elect the best person for the job. This is the report that they came out with, which we'll talk about in a second. 1976 came along, Buckley v. Vallejo. So in the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Act, they did ban unlimited contributions. They actually limited the amount of money people could donate, $1,000. The idea was for a campaign, you could donate up to $1,000, but no more per election cycle. Some people, including Buckley, said, hey, in 1976, I want to run for office, and if I want to spend $1 million of my own money, I should be able to do so. And the Supreme Court agreed. It said that's a violation of their freedom of speech under the First Amendment. So they should be able to do this. Now, in 2002, we see this unlimited amounts of money being spent on your own campaign is one thing, but we're going to limit soft money spending, this idea of unlimited amounts of money for party building purposes that was basically created in 1974. You could raise hard money, you could raise soft money. For every hard money dollar, you could get $2 or $3 in soft money, and it was kind of a formula, if you will. In 2002, BCRA banned that. They said soft money, you can't do that within the party anymore. You can do it outside. You want to raise it in a campaign that is outside it is an independent expenditure outside of the campaign and not affiliated to run an issue ad or whatever, go ahead. But unions and corporations can't do that within 30 to 60 days of an election period. You can't raise money within 60 days, and you can't use the money within 30 days. Now, that would be ruled unconstitutional in the Citizens United case, that particular portion. The issue ads, what we call the 527s today that we'll talk about under BCRA, the Supreme Court did say that was constitutional. But they said the ban on unions and corporations from being able to raise money and spend it accordingly was unconstitutional. And so that was a real problem for the Supreme Court, and they said that was a violation of their free speech in those terms. So in terms of soft money and and the idea of issue ads. Soft money was what was developed as a result of FECA, of the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Act. Basically said you could raise money for party building purposes. You didn't really have to track it in terms of where the money was coming from, as long as you, for every, again, $2 to $3 that was raised in soft money, you raised a dollar in hard money. The idea of a check that could be traced, could be followed back to its donor. And so grandma writes a check for $1,000, we can trace that. It's hard money. We know grandma donated it below the legal limit of $1,000, and therefore she benefits from that donation, and so does the campaign. It's hard money. Okay. The issue ads were raised as a result of 2002's Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, or the McCain-Feingold Act. Basically said issue ads can be created. This is what led to Code 527, which led to the 527s being created, that were issue ads that could focus on positive or negative aspects of campaigning, but couldn't advocate for a candidate in particular. And so it was really the soft money loophole that we started to see. It would be ruled constitutional. It would be ruled to be allowed under the Citizens United case by the Supreme Court. They said that part was okay, and actually that opened the floodgates to a number of other types of ways that money could be used in this independent expenditure, or this issue advocacy that we'll talk about. So while soft money was banned under McCain-Feingold, the soft money is now going to go to outside groups, and it's really going to change how outside groups are spending that money. So notice in 1974, hard money is limited to $1,000. The Federal Election Commission is created. And by the way, they also said you could create a PAC, a Political Action Committee. This is an organization that could be created by a candidate or an elected official, and they can have more than one, but you can raise additional money through these PACs, but they are limited in terms of how much money someone can donate, $5,000 usually. Today it's $5,000. You can donate to a particular PAC, a Political Action Committee. They are affiliated with a candidate, which is why there's a legal limit. And the candidate can have as many of them as they want, but they are limited in terms of how much somebody can donate by that $5,000 per PAC limit. In 1976, as we said, wealthy candidates can use their own money if they want to. Buckley did, and pretty much flushed it down the toilet because he lost. But nonetheless, he is more known for the case today than for his Senate bid. In 2002, we see the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act banning soft money. Hard money is now indexed for inflation. So as inflation rises, the hard money limit will also rise. They made it $2,000. Today it is $2,800. And it created these 527s we talked about. This soft money loophole outside of a campaign, more of an independent expenditure through issue ads that could be run as long as they didn't advocate for or against. Now in Citizens United in 2010, the Supreme Court said you don't have to necessarily stay away from advocating for or against someone in a 527. And this led to the creation of what we'll call super PACs, the idea of super PACs, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it basically said the ban on unions and corporations spending money under BCRA was unconstitutional. It said 527s and other outside groups could raise money and spend it to advocate for or against candidates, opening the door to 527s and super PACs, as I mentioned. And then also to a lot of dark money, because especially in a 501c4 environment, none of that needs to be reported to the FEC. Super PACs have to report to the FEC, but they don't necessarily have to do it on time. They can pay a fine, which most of them do, in order to keep raising money, and then reporting that information after the election when nobody really cares. So that's kind of the back and forth that we see there of kind of how the timeline goes. So let's delve a little deeper into some of these campaign finance aspects. So we have the Federal Election Commission after Watergate, after the hundreds of millions of dollars being raised in unlimited amounts, no real control over this, and really trying to reform campaign finance, led to the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974. It basically limited donations to $1,000 per person. Soft money could be collected as long as it is a 1 to 3 ratio, in terms of 3 soft money dollars for every 1 hard money dollar. And BCRA would rule that soft money unconstitutional anyway, which the Supreme Court would back up in the 2010 ruling. But this really begins the campaign finance reform timeline in terms of really where we begin, was looking at this in terms of how we can limit money's influence within campaigns. It also created PACs, the idea of political action committees. So under the Federal Election Campaign Act, you could have a PAC, a political action committee, and that would allow you to raise more money. So in addition to that $2,800 you can collect today, I can also open a political action committee, and I can raise $5,000 from each person that wrote me the check for $2,800. Now they can write a check for $5,000. And if I have more than one PAC, they can donate to more than one PAC. And it increases the amount of money that they can actually spend. So really, while FECA really gave clear guidelines about how campaigns were to finance themselves, it really expanded how much money people were able to give. So there were loopholes, of course, as we see time and again. This led to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, which again banned soft money, banned unions and corporations from spending money and raising money outside, basically limiting their free speech rights, which would be ruled unconstitutional in 2010. But it also limited those hard money donations by giving them a higher cap to that $2,000 index for inflation, which today is $2,800. This also opened, as I mentioned, 527s, the idea of an issue-oriented ad or an issue-oriented outside campaign, an independent expenditure, the beginning of independent expenditures that we would see here, essentially that was not coordinated with a campaign, but could run an ad through donations from multiple sources, again, the start of dark money, in which you could talk about what was going on, but you couldn't support a candidate. You couldn't advocate for them in this. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that part unconstitutional and said they can advocate for a particular candidate. And we would see these used in the 2004 campaign after the BCRA was passed. We would see 527s just begin to explode on the scene in terms of people using money in order to advocate for or against a particular issue. Now, with the Citizens United ruling, this opened the door for an expanded 527, essentially a 527 on steroids, which is the super PACs that we have today. And that is when outside groups are raising money in the millions. They have to report it eventually, but not right away. They can't have any coordination with a campaign, but they can spend all kinds of money with very, very few limits, if any, in terms of what they can do and say and how they can raise the money overall. And the Citizens United case in 2010 would back that up, would basically say, yes, super PACs do have this kind of power. They can continue to spend this kind of money, and these 527s can spend this kind of money, and it essentially created the super PACs that we have today. So sources of campaign funding today, an individual can donate up to $2,800, as we said, indexed for inflation based on that 2010 number from the BCRA, from the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. It was originally $2,000. Today it is indexed for inflation, so it's $2,800. Candidates can spend their own money. Buckley v. Vallejo said we can spend their own money. Political parties can also raise money. Again, they are limited. You can donate up to $50,000 to a political party, as well as political action committees. You can donate $5,000 to each political action committee in terms of another source of raising money within a campaign, within a coordinated effort. So the coordinated campaign in terms of using PACs to raise that money. There are limits, but again, $5,000 each, but you can still donate money that way. So hard money, grandma writes a check below the legal limit. Soft money, it is banned under BCRA, but it was how political parties raised money for party building purposes back in the old days. Now it is soft money that is raised through super PACs outside of the campaigns. PACs are still coordinating with the campaigns, but again, below the legal contribution limits, and that is $5,000 for the PACs. And then 527s can raise unlimited amounts of money. They can advocate for against issues and candidates based on those issues. They can go negative, and they often do. Really, we don't see as many growth of 527s today as we do super PACs, because really super PACs have a lot more flexibility and power today in terms of how they raise money and in terms of how they spend it. And the last one is the 501c4, the latest on the scene, and these are issues advocacy groups in which the majority of what they do is actually about issues, but they do step in and do a lot of political fundraising and spending of money on the issues that they care about for the candidates that support their issues. So as long as that is less than 50% of what they do, it is legal. They do not have to report any money to the FEC. They do not have to report who their campaign donors are. And they have to report to the IRS, but only in terms of how much money they're raising and that sort of thing. And otherwise, it's dark money. And it is the darkest of the dark money because we don't know who's donating, we don't know in what amounts, and we don't know what influence it is having on the issues that these people are trying to advocate for and against. So it is real dark money in terms of really funding the 501c4s in advocating particular candidates and issues, and they do it through the lens of a nonprofit status, of a status of a 501c4, of one that is an outside group. So unlimited in amounts in terms of that 501c4. They don't have to report anything to the FEC. They do to the IRS eventually, and we don't know their donors. Okay, we do know the donors of a super PAC. Eventually, we can find those out, and OpenSecrets.org is a great place to find those. But again, it's not a requirement by the election day. So a lot of that takes place after the election is over. They pay a fine, and it allows them to continue to collect money. You can pause the video here to take a closer look at what we've talked about. We've kind of gone over these already, but that is really what we see in terms of how people as candidates or elected officials can raise money, how political parties can raise money today, how political action committees, PACs, can raise money, how 527s raise money, more importantly, how super PACs today raise money, and the 501c4s that we see that are out there. Okay, and just to reiterate again, hard money, cold hard cash, collecting below the legal limit, which today is $2,800, and that is limited and regulated by the FEC. Soft money used to be party building purpose raised money. It is no longer. Now it is outside groups that raise that through independent expenditures, and this is money that is spent to support a candidate, but not contributing directly to the candidate or their campaign, okay? And it is unlimited in terms of those independent expenditures, in terms of what we see there. Elected officials can raise money through PACs, through political action committees. Again, $5,000 per PAC, per candidate. And they can spend the money on issues ads and supporting the candidate in the campaign and on voter mobilization and grassroots campaigning and that kind of thing. But we've seen a significant increase in the number of PACs because there's no limit to how many PACs you can have. There's just a limit to how much you can donate per PAC in terms of how that breaks down. So we see a lot of PACs that are out there today that are contributing to candidates below those legal limits. We saw this in the 2020 race. A number of PACs and contributions taking place here. Now, soft money, as I mentioned, was a party-building purpose way that political parties could raise millions of dollars, and they did. That spigot of cash was actually cut off when the Supreme Court when BCRA basically said in 2002 that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act banned soft money. It basically said if you're going to raise money, you got to do it outside of the political party, outside of the campaign. You got to do it through outside groups. So, and that has been the standard. So all of this dark money has gone to the super PACs and 501c4s that we see today. That really is where we see that money. Now, 527 was the real popular thing that was created after BCRA was implemented in 2002, and this took a hold in the 2004 race because 527s were the only place really at the time from IRS code 527 where you could donate money in unlimited amounts to raise awareness about particular issues. And this was used in the 2004 campaign actually against John Kerry. Swift Boat Veterans for Truth was the name of the 527 that was created in order to basically question his character. It never in the ad advocated for President Bush in that re-election campaign, but they raised unlimited amounts of money to be able to run this ad in swing states, and many say that it made all the difference. We don't know who the donors were. We don't know how much money they donated, but we know that they ran this in multiple markets on multiple days in multiple venues. So they raised, probably tens of millions of dollars or more to buy those spots We know that through revenue generated in the sale of those spots, but otherwise we don't really know a lot about them. But that really is a 527. So back then, in 2004, that was really the only avenue outside of a campaign or a political party where you could really raise all kinds of money. Now today, 527s aren't as popular because now you have a lot more options with the Supreme Court ruling in 2010 that gave super PACs their life and basically expanded 527s to do all kinds of things beyond just an issue ad. So we see a number of those taking shape today in terms of the super PACs that are out there. So the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act bans soft money, as I mentioned. You have to approve a message of an ad that you run. 527s can kind of do their own thing, and we see that they would. But if it is an ad that is run by your campaign, your political action committee, you have to approve the message if it is affiliated with you. And it banned corporations and unions, most importantly, from spending within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary, and the Supreme Court's going to declare that particular piece unconstitutional and say you're banning their free speech rights. That's no good. It did ban direct contributions to candidates from corporations and unions, and the Supreme Court upheld that piece and said now, because of their free speech rights, they can do it as an independent expenditure outside the campaign, and that is what gave super PACs their life. That is essentially what led to the emergence of super PACs today. So in saying that corporations and unions, hey, you can spend money and you can and whatever corporation there is, so people will create corporations just for the purpose of raising money through super PACs to be a slush fund, if you will, for billion-dollar donors or billionaires to basically donate and spend money for or against a particular campaign. This is what led to the birth of super PACs in terms of what we see there. So, and this is a landmark case, so it's really important that you know Citizens United essentially struck down those bans on corporations and unions in terms of their in terms of how they could spend money through their free speech. And it led to a significant increase, an explosion of super PACs, these former 527s that now don't have limits based on corporations and unions, which were banned at the time. Now they don't have limits, so they can spend all kinds of money, and that's exactly what they have done. And so we see a huge growth in that particular space today. There is an explainer on this, Carrie LaMoney does, that I would encourage you to check out on the Citizens United case, the landmark case there, in terms of breaking that down to be able to explain it better for the SCOTUS FRQ. But again, super PACs really took shape as a result of this case. Now they can raise unlimited amounts of money. They don't have to disclose their donors to anybody but the FEC. They don't have to share in real time. They can pay fines in order to do that. And they can't donate to a political party directly, but they can create a shadow campaign, and that's exactly what super PACs have done. They've created a shadow campaign in terms of operating it independently, operating it separate from the candidate, but raising all kinds of money to support that candidate outside of the campaign. And we continue to see this. This was in the 2016 race in terms of the amount of money that was spent in the millions to support particular candidates. And so this essentially brought back the idea of soft money. And so we see here in one of these articles that soft money is back. And everybody is cashing in. And it's not the political parties that can collect it, but it's the outside groups. And so that's where the money is going today, which, going back to our last chapter on political parties, really diminishes the power of political parties. If they can't raise money like this, then all of a sudden these super PACs are going to have more power and more campaign cash and going to be much more appetizing and appealing to the candidates themselves, because super PACs can raise hundreds of millions of dollars for them. Political parties can't do that anymore. It's a lot harder for them to do that. So that's what leads to this growth, this explosion in super PACs that are created today. Now, the last category we get to is what we call issue advocacy. And this is a 501c4. Issue advocacy, basically you're advocating a particular issue or a particular focus, and most of your time is on this issue, but you can spend almost half of your resources, not quite 50%, but anything under that, You can spend, in terms of your resources, to advocate for people or against people that help or hurt your issues. So you can advocate for a candidate or against a candidate with relation to these issues if it is tied into this idea of issue advocacy. And you can raise millions of dollars of dark money without having to disclose to your to the FEC any of your donors. You have to report the monies to the IRS, but you don't have to report it to the Federal Election Commission. So the Federal Election Commission never sees who's donating to 501c4s. This is the darkest of the dark money that we see that's out there. And it really is issue advocacy. So the idea here is you're focused on a particular issue and who is helping you. You can read between the lines. You may not have a, vote for so-and-so, but you can create an ad that either denigrates a particular candidate you don't want to win or supports a candidate that you want to win without ever saying elect them or defeat them. And there's lots of ways that you can go about doing that. And there's a huge ton of cash going into these spaces to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And now we're even seeing even more than that in 2020. We're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars going into these spaces. This is a significant amount of campaign cash being spent outside of political parties, obviously that they have no control over, that is significantly dark money. And we've seen this, over $1 billion in dark money coming from this 2020 election, just from all of these outside groups that are spending, and raising all kinds of cash through various sources that we may never know about. In terms of who's giving and who's getting, as I mentioned, corporations and unions have a lot more power over these super PACs and 527s now that they can create these things. So we see a lot more super PAC space because there's a lot more you can do with it in terms of not just running ads, but grassroots mobilization in super PACs and the idea of helping create shadow campaigns on the ground in states where it matters. These are what super PACs can do. They're unaffiliated with the campaign. They can't coordinate, but they can do a lot more than just run ads, which is what a 527 was designed to do, was to run commercials, run advertisements, and that really was their focus, where super PACs can do a lot more than that. It's not as limited as a 527 once was. And we've seen even in the dark money, this is just stuff we can trace, not the stuff that we can't. So even just looking at some of these, you can see millions of dollars being spent by different groups on both sides of the aisle, right? On the right and on the left, in terms of money being spent here. It is significant, again, to point out that over $1 billion in that election was spent from dark money sources. And we see time and again that it's both parties that are doing it. In some of the data that Open Secrets released said Democrats were dominating the dark money field, where this tends to be something that Democrats use as a bludgeoning of Republicans, but they both do it. They both do it, and depending on who's kind of the favored horse in the candidacy for election, the money flows where the votes are going to go. And so if people see that Democrats have a likely opportunity to pick up to win the election, the money is going to flow there. And some groups donate to both. Just to make sure they hedge their bets. So there's a lot of dark money out there that is flowing, and as we can see, over $1 billion in that last election that is having a significant impact here on races, and could make the difference between some of these really close races, as we saw in some of the electoral college maps in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. So some final thoughts. Campaigns never end, okay? The campaign for 2022 has already begun. It started the day after the election ended, and it continues to grow. We saw $14 billion spent in the 2020 cycle. I mentioned $1 billion in dark money just through those big election races. But this is a part of our GDP. I mean, this is a part of our economy. $14 billion being spent just in the 2020 cycle for campaigns and elections at all levels, at the local level, the House districts, as well as Senate seats, those running for governor and whatnot. everybody is competing trying to appeal to their base and trying to compete for those votes in the middle, those people that are independents, those people that are de-aligning from parties. And time and again, politicians need to look at this in terms of where's the money coming from, who's going to help me out, and do they take a trustee, trust me model where they kind of go it alone and make their own decisions? Do they take a delegate model where they're really voting the way that people would want them to? Or is it a combination of the political model where sometimes it's a trustee, sometimes it's a delegate? And how does that shape up their prospects for winning the election next time? Are they able to win over their constituents with what's going on here? And what is their policy agenda in terms of pushing these sorts of things? These are the issues that are going to be plaguing the 2020 midterms, the 2022 midterms. And what we're going to see in terms of, if 2020 is any gauge, what we're going to see in terms of even more money being spent in the 2022 midterms. We've already seen that with a lot of the fundraising that's going on between the two parties and the outside groups in terms of trying to raise money to really formulate their get out the vote efforts and to really put their money back behind political parties to show their relevance, because super PACs are eating their lunch and having an easier time at raising money to eat their lunch. So that is significant here. All right, you can pause the video if you want to take a closer look at some of these questions. We are going to move on in a moment to electing a president. Okay, so let's take a look at electing a president. Some things to think about as we're moving forward here. How does a candidate become their party's nominee? How do they win the presidency? Why do we have the Electoral College? And what do we know about the candidates that are running? Well, congressional elections are very different than presidential ones. We can see that how people vote is very similar. We have a lot of safe seats in which they are gerrymandered for that purpose so that members of the House will win re-election time and time again. Notice that the congressional winner is going to get usually over 60% of the vote because of gerrymandering, because of the support. Where in the presidential election, remember it's by state, and the idea here is whoever wins the most votes in that state wins the electoral votes for that state. So presidential elections much more competitive than congressional ones because of the fact that the House seats are so gerrymandered by states and their political preferences. So incumbency advantage is important here. If a president is well known, if they have a policy agenda that is supported by the people, if they can use the media as part of their bully pulpit to really get their messages out there, and they can win, or if they've won before in different elections, winning a presidential election again is usually easier to have the incumbency advantage. Now, obviously, if you're in a recessionary period or you have a pandemic like we experienced in 2020, that can be a harder time to do, but it is still possible to be able to use incumbency advantage to your advantage and to see you as presidential. How does this cycle flow? Well, we start with what we call an invisible primary, kind of sorting out the candidates who are thinking about running and contemplating, which takes us to the primaries, then to the national convention, and on to the general election. So keep that in mind in terms of the cycle. We start with the invisible primary, we move to primaries, then to the national convention where we quote unquote select the nominee, and then to the general election where we actually vote and ultimately leading to the Electoral College. So starting with this presidential preference primary, essentially all the 50 states over time are going to hold their primaries and select from their parties who the nominees are going to be. Now, we know we have open primaries in which some people can go in and select either party ballot, Democrats or Republicans, and we have closed primaries like we do in Maryland. Virginia has an open primary. Maryland has a closed primary. You have to be a registered member of a political party in order to vote in their closed primary. So all 50 states do this in some way, shape, or form. Some still hold caucuses, by the way, in which they're doing a lot of the same thing. They just call it a caucus. But the idea here is you're going to start to see a nominee emerge. You're going to see a front runner start to emerge. And the media love the horse race, as we know. So whoever's going to win the most delegates of their states at the convention, ultimately in terms of pledged delegates, is going to win the nomination. Okay, delegates are people who go to the convention. Usually they are nominated by those in their state. When they hold the primary, you select who the delegates are that will run to the convention and pledge their delegates to support a particular candidate. If you win a state, you win the delegates for that state. Now, it sometimes is broken down by proportionally. So if you win 55% of the vote, you win 55% of the delegates for that state. But you've got to win a majority of the delegates in order to win the party's nomination. And then you'll get the formal nomination at the National Convention by essentially winning. Now, there is what's called a winner-take-all primary. Again, some states do this differently. Some award it proportionally. In that, you win 60% of the votes, you win 60% of the delegates. But a winner-take-all primary is those with the most votes win all of the state's delegates. Now, that's what we have in the Electoral College. It is a winner-take-all in all 48 of the 50 states, Nebraska and Maine being the exception. They do the proportional electors, and that's basically whoever wins the particular congressional district wins that particular elector. So we saw Nebraska, for instance, the district around Omaha actually went for Joe Biden. He won one electoral vote in Nebraska for that purpose. And then Trump won one of the districts in Maine. And so he won a congressional district. So they kind of swapped and canceled each other out there. But that is an example of using proportional representation, which is a little different than the winner-take-all, where you win the most votes, you win all of the delegates or all of the electors for that particular state. Super Tuesday, let's talk about it because it is an important one. It's where we have the most primaries, and this is when a significant number of states, usually like 17 or 20 or 25 states, will all have their primary on the same day. That's Super Tuesday. It's like having a national primary, if you will, and basically this is where we start to see if a nominee has not emerged, then they definitely will have emerged after this is over, or at least if they've tightened the race, it really comes down to this will solidify someone's support in that regard. But Super Tuesday, really important. Think of it as like a national primary. The other super to talk about is super delegates. This is only in the Democratic Party. Republicans don't have super delegates, but these are people who are like retired elected officials or celebrities, other people who go to the convention. They are not pledged to vote a particular way, and they decide who they're going to vote for at the convention. So they can swing their delegates one way or another to support a candidate. Hillary Clinton, for instance, got a lot of super delegates, people voting for her, which prolonged her nomination in 2016 with Bernie Sanders because he was winning a lot of the caucuses. She was kind of splitting with him on the primaries, but it was the superdelegates that really put her over in the end. Now, Democrats have changed this model. This is changing. They've really dialed back a lot of the superdelegates. They still have them, but they've dialed back their power to really give more power in the hands of the primaries and caucuses that we see out there. So that is changing. But what isn't changing is the National Convention is really think of it as a pep rally to nominate your presidential candidate. And this is where it's done officially, to nominate at the National Convention. Basically the rah-rah, here we are, aren't we awesome? And really rev up the base and get them out to get people out to vote is really the purpose of that National Convention. That is where formally the nominee is established for the party. And then from there, they hit the ground running trying to get out the vote. But the party conventions are really designed to rev up the base, to really get them excited about the candidate, so they will go out and do everything they can to support that candidate to help them win the general election and ultimately the presidency. Primaries, as we've talked about, are more popular than ever today. We see a lot more primaries in the primary system than we do conventions or caucuses because it's very easy for people to go in, vote, and leave. It's a lot harder with a caucus. It takes longer. With a convention, everybody's stuck there, sitting there. So it's a lot easier for a primary, and most states are moving to the primary system. Now, it's not without its critics. where many states are concerned that they don't have an early place in the calendar to really address some of the early states that have advantages, like Iowa and New Hampshire, Nevada and South Carolina. They're like, after those 4 states are done, nobody really cares anymore. So that's a frustration of the primary system. It has led to people talking about a national primary or a Super Tuesday in which all the states go at the same time. But again, the concern there is that how can candidates get to different states if they're all on the same day? That applies pressure, and then the smaller states are always going to lose. So that is one of the concerns about the national primary, which is why some states keep their primary where it is. But like Maryland, who has the primary so late in the season that nobody seems to care, nobody's coming to Maryland because by then the primary is over, and you already know who the nominee is. So those are some of the aspects of the primary system that are criticized quite a bit. In the general election, whoever wins the Electoral College wins the presidency. It takes 270 electoral votes, which is one more than half. There are 538 electoral votes, 535, 100 from the Senate, 435 from the House, because we have 435 House members, so there's 435. We have 100 from the Senate, so there's 535. And then we have 3 from the 23rd Amendment, which gives D.C. 3 electoral votes in terms of being able to vote in the Electoral College, and that's where we get the number 538. In order to win the Electoral College, per the Constitution, you need one more than half, and this is in Article 2 of the Constitution. And one more than half, if you divide 538 by 2, you get 269. One more than half would be 270. So I always tell students to remind them that the road to the White House is on Interstate 270. 270 electoral votes is what it takes to win the election and thus become the President of the United States. Now, the Electoral College is won by, again, that winner-take-all strategy in most states, 48 of the 50, Nebraska and Maine being the exceptions, as we mentioned, which means if you win the most votes, not a majority, but a plurality even, if you win the most votes of any candidate running in the Electoral College in that state, you win all of the electoral votes for that state. So Georgia, for instance, has 16 electoral votes. With Joe Biden winning that state, winning the most votes, even though it was close, he won those votes. He wins all electoral votes for that state, all 16 for that state. And the same is true of Ohio. President Trump won Ohio. Doesn't matter what he wins by, he wins all 18 electoral votes in Ohio. So the idea here was the Electoral College was designed to prevent people who didn't know what was going on in politics and weren't informed from being able to participate. The concern was it would be a popularity contest, and people wouldn't really be informed in making those decisions based on who would be the best person for the job, not just who was popular. So that's why the founders and framers went with the Electoral College. It is very elitist in terms of the theory of influence here, the elite theory, because it is basically putting the power in the hands of those electors. And while we see today that it is the popular vote that drives a lot of those electors to vote that way, it wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case that they had to do that. And so it is a very elite theory of influence that drove the Electoral College. As I mentioned, 530 total electoral votes. You need 270 to win, one more than half. And the popular vote doesn't matter. Ask Hillary Clinton, ask Al Gore, ask Samuel Tilden. None of them won the Electoral College, even though they won the popular vote in their respective election years. You take the state's electoral votes, add up their number of representatives and senators. That's how you get their electors. So in Maryland, we have 8 representatives in the House. We have 2 in the Senate. 8 plus 2 is 10, and we have 10 electoral votes here in the state of Maryland. As I mentioned, winner take all is the person who wins the most votes wins that state's electoral votes. Now, the concern with the Electoral College is obviously smaller states never have a chance to really have an impact, and so the candidates aren't going to visit a state that has that is either a safe state or has a really low number of electoral votes. For instance, North Dakota is a safe state for Republicans. It's voted pretty conservatively, and it's only 3 electoral votes. So the likelihood of a major presidential candidate going to North Dakota is pretty much between slim and none. they're not going to really go there because there's no reason for them to go there. And that leads to these small states being overrepresented and the other states not really having a whole lot of voice in that respect. We also see that candidates in the Electoral College are going to focus on the swing states, the battlegrounds, as the cartoon implies here. You're focused on Florida and Ohio, Wisconsin. That really hasn't changed. Now, Virginia and Colorado has kind of gone into the blue column. Florida kind of into the red column. But I would say Ohio, same thing. Now, in this election, we saw more Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia that are happening there. Now, what happens if nobody gets 270 votes? Well, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they get 1 vote per state delegation, not per elector, but per delegation. So there are only 50 states voting. If that had gone to the House of Representatives in the 2020 election, because there are more state delegations made up of majority Republican than Democrat, Donald Trump would have won. The House of Representatives only decides the president. The Senate would decide the vice president. So also in that, though, if you looked at the votes by state, again, Republicans would have chosen Mike Pence because in the Senate, because they are more represented in the Senate than the Democrats are. Now, after about 6 weeks, usually in December, the electors will go to their state capitals on a Wednesday. Usually, I believe it's the second Wednesday in December, and they will cast their ballots. They'll basically write the certification papers, and that will be sent to Washington, which in the first week of January will be opened. We know this happened on January 6th, which was the insurrection that took place on Capitol Hill. And this was the real election day when the votes are counted. The votes are certified by the Senate, and a winner is declared that will then 2 weeks later on January 20th take the oath of office and become the next president and vice president of the United States. So that is kind of what we see. Now, we've heard a lot of complaints about the Electoral College over the years. People want to get rid of it. Again, you'd have to amend the Constitution in order to do so, and we've only amended the Constitution 27 times. So you would need that 2/3, 3/4 going on, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to basically approve that constitutional amendment. And again, we hear all kinds of complaints as to why people want to get rid of the Electoral College, but we have yet to see a bill come out of the Congress that actually gets rid of the Electoral College. So until that happens, we continue to use it. And I heard that in 2000 when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush, and we've heard it ever since for the last 20 years. We continue to hear it about people wanting to get rid of the Electoral College, but Congress has yet to move. So until an amendment is approved or proposed by Congress and approved by 3/4 of those states, we are stuck with the Electoral College under Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, there are some interesting thoughts to think about as we head to reapportionment. The idea of the census data being used to determine how many electoral votes go to each state. We saw in 2010, these were some of the changes that were taking place. We saw losses in the Rust Belt and in the Midwest. They lost seats, and they're slated to lose some again. We saw those in the Sun Belt and in the South actually gain seats, Louisiana being the exception because of Hurricane Katrina. They lost a seat there. But that is what is significant in terms of the changes in the Electoral College and what's happening there. So if no one gets a majority of the electoral votes, who decides the presidency? As I mentioned, it's the House of Representatives that decides the president. 1 vote per state delegation decides the presidency, and then the Senate would decide the vice presidency. So it would go to the House of Representatives. And again, 1 vote per state delegation. That would have gone to the Republicans in that case. And so it doesn't matter how you vote with the popular vote. That doesn't matter. It matters with the Electoral College. And the Electoral College votes are what propel you to the presidency. It did to President Trump in 2016. It did to Joe Biden in 2020. And again, you can click on the slides in the MyMCPS classroom to get the state-by-state results if you want to take a look at those. Some reforms we've heard about as we close this out. Some reforms we've heard about here: direct popular election. People vote with a popular election. Again, you'd have to amend the Constitution in order to do this. We've heard of the Interstate Compact, ideas that states would go along with the popular vote as long as there were enough states in their electoral votes, as long as the enough states to actually swing 270 or more states to this would actually take place. We are not there yet in terms of the number of votes. There's only about 172 that have done this, so you're about 100 electoral votes short in terms of making that happen. But that is the Interstate Compact idea, or the national popular vote, in which states would abide by their electors voting for the national popular vote. And there is a question as to whether that's even a constitutional challenge at the Supreme Court level as to whether they could actually do that. So one, we're not even close to being there. You're 100 electoral votes away. And two, even if you were, the Supreme Court's probably going to weigh in on that. And who knows what they would decide in terms of that court. Proportional representation, they could go this route, which is do what Maine and Nebraska did, award your electoral votes proportionally by district and then by at-large for Senate situations. If this had actually happened in 2008, Obama would have won, but he would not have won in 2012. So I think that's kind of interesting if proportional voting had happened. And by proportional voting, what I mean there is you win that district, you win that particular electoral vote. Biden did this in Omaha. He won that particular vote. Meanwhile, Trump won the rest of the state of Nebraska. So Trump won 4 electoral votes there, and Biden won 1. And as I said, that's something that all states could do. They could decide to go proportionally, but none other than Nebraska and Maine have done that up to this point. In terms of looking at the schedule for presidential elections, we saw this. Usually caucuses kick off late January, the Iowa caucus, and then you have the the New Hampshire primary as the first in the nation primary, usually in early February, and that kind of kicks off campaign season. And that's where we see primaries happening in all of the states, essentially the playoffs, leading to the Super Tuesday event, and then a nominee, which then will attend and get the coronation in the national convention in the summertime, and that'll launch them into the general election season, which is usually after Labor Day, heading into November, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, in terms of what we see there. If more states were to front load, the idea of front loading, moving their primaries up, what would we see in terms of campaigns? Well, we have a much shorter time period and a much more competitive race for dollars. Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada really competing for dollars against a bunch of other states. What impact would that have on the economies of those states that are reliant on those funds? Well, to be continued. We'll see how that takes shape. But we haven't seen a whole lot of front loading yet. However, there is talk about, with the debacles of Iowa last campaign season, whether or not that's going to remain. But again, to be continued. We'll see what happens there. All right, presidential primaries and caucuses. I thought this was kind of interesting in terms of comparing the front-loading model. You can pause and take a look at this and try and answer the FRQ there. But what it means is, in the end, that there's a lot of campaigning going on. There's a lot of money being spent in the campaign, and that can have a significant impact in where dollars get spent and how dollars get spent, and that's really important in terms of how that breaks down. All right, let's go to congressional elections as our clock runs out here. A primary election, as we've talked about, is when you're choosing a party nominee. In a closed primary like we have in Maryland, you have to be a registered party member in order to vote in that election. An open primary, like Virginia has, you can go in and select which ballot you want, and you can vote accordingly. And in a caucus, you're essentially sitting there like an Iowa caucus and choosing who the nominees are. And you can see in the map down there in the lower right-hand corner which are open versus closed primaries or modified primaries, as the case may be. Midterm elections are coming up. 2022 is a midterm election. It is the term in between a presidential election. So 2020 was a presidential, 2024 will be a presidential, 2022 is that midterm. President's party usually loses seats. in those midterm elections. And so, and the reason is because a lot of times it's the angry people that come out that are not happy with the way things are going. There's usually lower turnout in those midterm elections, and there's usually holding the party in power responsible, which means they lose seats. Now, that's going to be an interesting situation when you have a House that is just barely Democratic and a Senate that literally is split 50-50 with the vice president breaking the tie, to see what will happen there in terms of those midterm elections. But remember, incumbency advantage definitely helps, but not always. We know that while there are safe seats in the House, they're not safe from being ousted entirely, and some of those are in swing states that can go the other way, especially if people aren't happy with what the president is doing. So that can have an impact as well. Incumbency advantage definitely helps, but remember, we're redrawing district lines, and states are going to gerrymander, and the majority of states are right now the task of gerrymandering or redistricting is led with Republican dominated legislatures. So the majority of the 50 states have state legislatures that are being currently run by Republicans. So they're probably going to redraw those lines to include safe seats and probably try and pick up some seats. That can have an impact on who controls Congress in 2023 and 2024. Okay, incumbency advantage definitely helps in the House. 90% of the time, House members retake their seats. But again, all you need is a few in order to go away. And the role of PACs and super PACs are definitely going to have an impact on this in terms of the in terms of this upcoming election. So stay tuned. We will see if that name recognition or visibility or that that campaign money within and outside of the campaign, what impact it really does have. Here's a refresher on congressional elections. You can pause the video to take a look at those. I think you know all of those. Remember that most of these seats are not close. They are very safe seats because of incumbency advantage. The last thing I want to cover today is in modern campaigns, and this is the idea that what do we see time and again? We see a lot of outside money, dark money, super PACs and 501c4s. So we see a lot more political consultants, people that are polling and fundraising and strategizing and focused on what the campaigns are looking for and what they need. This leads to a lot of campaign costs, a lot of significant growth in these areas, and a lot more specialized pollsters that are working in these particular venues, which also leads, if the campaign costs are rising, that means we're going to have to raise more money and much larger fundraising efforts here that are going on between the PACs and the super PACs and all of the money that is being raised as a result of having to fund all of these organizations. And we can see, you know, to the tune of, this was in the 2012 race, you've got almost $2 billion right there, just in terms of what is being spent. And in the 2020 race, it was no different in terms of the amount of money being spent out there. As we talked about, over $1 billion with dark money and outside groups spending in those cycles. And the cycles are growing. We've got an invisible primary where candidates are already making trips to Iowa. They're already making speeches. They're already kind of positioning themselves for these races in Iowa and New Hampshire and other primary locations. So that is significant in terms of, wow, does this election cycle ever end? The answer is no, it doesn't. And so that is where it is an extended cycle. We see a lot of them running for office and kind of throwing their hat into the ring right now. We see people like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and Donald Trump and others kind of talking about these particular issues in order to try and get their name out there and keep their name out there. They're really relying on social media for a lot of this because that's where they're going to drive a lot of their cash. We saw that in 3 months, Josh Hawley, the senator, the junior senator from Missouri, actually raised over $3 million after the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. $3 million in those small money donations. That's a lot of money that he can use to parlay, especially considering that he's not up again until 2024. A lot of money that he can use to parlay into a presidential campaign, and he just might do that in making that happen. So I hope you found this helpful. Definitely check out the review questions that you see here. Here is a list of concepts to take a look at from this unit that I think you'll also find helpful. And in the next chapter, we're going to be looking at the role of interest groups, and then the media as we close it out. I hope you found this overview helpful, and good luck on the upcoming assessment.